every murder, there are clues. Vital evidence that points to who the killer is and how they killed.
It wasn't a normal crime scene.
Forensics were crucial.
Every contact leaves a trace.
It's down to detectives, crime scene investigators, and forensic experts to piece those clues together.
It's like trying to do a jigsaw when you haven't got the picture on the box.
Using cutting-edge techniques and the power of science.
His jeans had the profile of the crime scene on them. I know that he had knelt down on the soil.
To convict the killers.
We've got to find him and catch him.
He's probably the most dangerous person I've prosecuted.
And bring justice to the victims.
She's never, ever coming home.
She'll never be forgotten, ever.
In this episode, a double murder shatters the peace of the English countryside.
The bodies were dumped so close together, both of them were strangled. I just didn't feel it was a coincidence.
A baby daughter is left without a mother.
No one can replace your mum. 2 pictures, that's all I have of her in my life.
Detectives determined to uncover the truth.
When you don't know who the person is, you've got no place to start. They had no idea who she was.
And a DNA discovery that had to be kept under wraps.
I was very clear that no one needs to know about this. The most important thing was that this didn't dribble out across the force, in the wider community.
This is Forensics, catching the killer.
Every time I come back here, it's always a bit chilling, really. I actually cycle on this lane sometimes with friends, and when I come back here, I kind of always go back to December '93. And just wonder, you know, what earth was going on? Why did it happen? So this is the lane leading out of Swinford. It's a narrow single-track lane. Places like Leicestershire probably average about 12 murders a year. Most of them are in the city and related to domestic violence, etc. Having one in the county like this in a village is unheard of.
In December 1993, a woman exercising her horses on a quiet road near the village of Swinford in rural Leicestershire made a terrible discovery: the body of a missing woman called Samo Paul.
This is where Samo was found. She was deep in the ditch. We can't see into the ditch now, but it was because the lady was on a horse and up high that she was able to look down and see what she saw. She thought it was a mannequin because actually, and tragically, Samo was virtually naked. There's no question that she'd been in there a long time. The body had been washed clean, completely forensically, and she could easily have been there 2 or 3 weeks, but covered at times with water, covered with times with snow in that December.
Mick Creedon was a detective inspector for Leicestershire Police at the time.
I did come to the scene on more than one occasion because for me it was important to understand everything about the location, what had happened, and start to think like the offender might think. Why would he come here and why would he pick this lane, of any lane? Whoever's doing it is seeking to hide a body. And this is not displaying a trophy, look what I've done. This is a deliberate attempt to secrete it, because very few people use this road. It's very, very hidden.
Samo Paul wasn't from Leicestershire. She came from the West Midlands, and police discovered she supplemented her benefits with occasional spells of sex work. Pete Priestley was a detective in Leicestershire Police.
Samo Poole, 20-year-old lady, lived with her boyfriend in Birmingham. On the night that she was last seen, 3rd of December 93, she travelled by taxi to the Balsall Heath area of Birmingham, which is a known red light district. I believe she was an occasional prostitute. She wasn't massively well known. You could almost say the perfect victim.
And the next day, her boyfriend who lived with her went and reported her missing to the police. And the West Midlands started what is known as the missing person inquiry.
Samo's loved one's worst fears were confirmed when the missing person report was quickly matched to the awful find on that quiet rural road.
There's something called the best chance rule. And in this case, the best chance to investigate the murder sat with the West Midlands Police, because that's where Samo lived, that's where she worked, that's where her family and associates were. And so West Midlands Police took primacy for the investigation immediately.
So West Midlands were to run the Samo Poole inquiry. But Leicestershire Police were soon facing another murder case on their beat. "7 a.m. on the 3rd of March 1994, and a dog walker was confronted by a shocking sight on another of Leicestershire's quiet country lanes. It was the body of a woman later identified as Tracy Turner, who was from Staffordshire and who was also a sex worker.
So this is Bitterswell, not far from Swinford, where Samo was left. It's just near Lutterworth, but very close to the M1, M6, the whole motorway network of the East Midlands, West Midlands coming together. This is where Tracy was found back in March 94. It's a quiet, single-lane road, leads to nowhere. Big, wide grass verge. Her body was found dumped by the side of the road. Tracy was naked. She'd been strangled. There were marks in her back suggesting that the killer had killed her from behind, maybe with a ligature. There were certainly small marks where she'd been stabbed and snicked with a knife. There were signs that she'd been dragged. She must have been brought here by a vehicle, and just by the side of her were the tyre marks in the mud, which obviously were important evidence in the investigation. Both the murders of Samo and Tracy, they weren't just brutal, they sought to humiliate and degrade the victim by stealing everything from them, personal effects. In Tracy's case, even her hearing aid. So I think this was thought through, it was deliberate, it was callous.
But thoughts about the killer's mentality weren't the top priority.
You know, the important thing is they're treated forensically, analytically as crime scenes. And that's where really we should be. And the speculation as to why there, why here, why this, is secondary to collecting evidence and trying to prove a case. In the case of Tracy all those years ago, it was a difficult scene, but there were opportunities. Certainly the tyre marks, they were preserved, albeit the weather was appalling. But the fact that she was stripped naked took away many of the contact opportunities that forensic science gives us. Coming back to these sites is a bit eerie because we're here on a beautiful summer's day. We can hear birds, we can hear traffic in the distance, and we look at countryside. They were very different 30 years ago. These were murder sites where women were deposited after having been abducted, raped and murdered.
And it looked like these could be lengthy inquiries. Both cases seemed to be stranger murders, notoriously the most difficult to detect.
stranger murder is classed as a Cat A murder and was back in that at that time. Normally people who get murdered are murdered by people they know. And anything that appears to be a stranger murder is clearly more difficult to investigate, especially across borders.
You don't know where to start. And if you look at the victim and then look at associates, friends, family, workmates, colleagues, and you eliminate all them, then you start going into that stranger area where you end up looking at really bad people.
Whether it was one killer or two, it was clear from the outset that forensics would be the key to solving two murders which had brought tragedy to the usually benign Leicestershire countryside. March 1994. Two women had been murdered and their bodies dumped in quiet country lanes in Leicestershire over a period of 3 months. Birmingham woman Samo Paul and Tracy Turner, who was from Staffordshire, had both been involved in sex work. Mike Dolan covered the case for Central TV News, starting at the location where Samo was found.
It would not have been an area that I would have regularly gone to because it's so quiet. This is a rural part of Leicestershire. Not a lot happens there.
Both Tracy and Samo were left in very small villages in South Leicestershire where there's hardly any crime, let alone violent crime. And there was really real concern and shock at the time.
It made it scary for other people. They weren't sure whether this man would strike again.
Samo Paul was murdered in December 1993. But murders don't just impact on a moment in time. The ripples spread out for years. As Viella Paul knows all too well.
I was 8 months at the time, and I was living with my mum's partner and my mum. He was babysitting me, and he realised there was a time when she was due to come home, and she didn't come home, so he went and reported it to the police. Obviously, as their duty of care, they had to take him in for questioning. So I was placed into social care for a period of time. And then after that, I was given custody to my mum's sister, and she looked after me from, I'd say, probably about 9 months to 18 years old.
Samo had been bringing Viella up in tough conditions.
Looking back at what my mum had back then, it was very minimal. Like, there was no furniture in there, like not even a set of drawers. There was no cooker, no fridge, just maybe a kettle. So I think day by day she was literally just living like that.
So Samo had drifted into prostitution to help provide for her young child.
I understand now what she did for a reason. But seeing everything that she went through and what she's had in her life, it wasn't very much. I think given time, things would have changed. She would have maybe stood on her own feet. I think everyone, they make mistakes and they learn from their mistakes. She never got to learn from a mistake. Just looking at your photos, you envision what she would have been like. Very chatty person, loved her fashion, very bossy. That's all you can go on now, isn't it? Just pictures, 2 pictures. That's all I have of her in my life, 2 pictures. And some clothes that which all have the same smell of her, which is nice. I just hold them clothes and I think, oh, this is what you smell like. You close your eyes. And you envision her in those clothes. And she's talking to me. She says to me, don't cry, you got this.
Samo's lifestyle and her occasional work in the red light area of Birmingham made detecting her murder even more difficult. So forensics would be vital. Orlando Elmhurst was the crime scene manager who attended the location where Samo was found.
The normal procedure when you get to a major scene, there's sort of 4 or 5 main steps. The first one is you have to preserve it, or at least protect it. The next one is to then record it. The next thing is to actually get to the body and approach it, so you then have to forensically clean your path to the body. The body then needs to be removed and taken to a mortuary, and you really have to, as fast as possible, carry out a post-mortem, and then they can establish cause of death. Then, obviously, what one will do is then investigate the crime scene itself in a minute detail and collect as much forensic evidence as you can. These are little things that can give you clues and hopefully identify who or who may not be responsible.
Samo's body, clothed only in a short white top, seemed to have been there for some time. She was taken away for a post-mortem examination, which would help give Orlando's team a steer on what to look for at the scene.
Strangulation was given as a preliminary cause of death. We knew at this stage we weren't looking for anything like a knife or a gun or anything of that nature, but we were looking for potential things that could have caused strangulation. That involved us on our hands and knees going through all the grass, trying to see if there's anything that may have been deposited. But very little was found that could have been associated with the incident.
Samo's killer had either been clever or lucky. There was no trace of who he might be from the forensics at the scene. There was, though, more to go on at the Tracy Turner crime scene. Not least because police could pinpoint more accurately when the killer had disposed of her body.
At 5 in the morning, a group of people walked past the scene and she wasn't there. At 7 a.m. she was.
Orlando Elmhurst was again one of the first people at the crime scene when Tracy Turner's body was discovered.
It was very strange. It was the only time I've ever had a sort of deja vu. Things were just so similar. Although the body wasn't in a ditch, it was lying on the roadside, on the verge, and it was a quiet country road out of the village. And this is really weird, this sort of thought that I've been here before. We could see that there were track marks, tyre marks, leading up to the body. So these meant that we had to start recovering those, photographing them, casting them, and obviously recording where we'd got them. At the post-mortem, it was fairly obvious that strangulation was the cause. We could see a ligature mark around the throat, and there were scratches under the chin where presumably she was trying to prevent it happening.
There was one major issue. There was nothing at the crime scene that could initially identify the victim.
They had no idea who she was. In a conventional murder investigation, the most important thing to understand is who the victim is, their lifestyle, their associates, their movements, and that will often lead you towards the suspect. When you don't know who the person is, you've got no place to start. And so they went to all forced missing from home records in case, like Samo, she'd been reported missing, nothing.
Nobody had reported her missing. And that was partially sad as well, because you kind of think, who is she? Is nobody missing her?
Her fingerprints were taken, and Tracy had some convictions for prostitution and theft where she would have been fingerprinted. And the national approach and national database was used, and the fingerprints were matched up. It took 2 weeks to do, but that gave the identity of who she was. And then from that, Leicestershire police were able to trace her mother and go and confirm, sadly, that it was her daughter who'd been killed.
We discovered that Tracy was profoundly deaf. She couldn't hear. We also discovered that she didn't have many friends. She would often go to motorway service stations where she would try to befriend lorry drivers. We believe that part of the reason that she was a sex worker was for companionship.
Inquiries soon revealed the last sighting of Tracy was at Hilton Park Services north of Birmingham, a drive of over 50 miles from where her body was discovered.
Things were beginning to look sort of quite similar by this stage. So we've got similar sort of deposition sites, we've got similar sort of victims, and a similar sort of cause of death.
Same-O Paul was basically, the body was dumped in the open. Tracy Turner was dumped on the side of the road on a verge. It's very similar, and because they were so close in proximity, it was a logical conclusion that they would be connected.
A friend of mine was the superintendent who led the investigation into Tracy's death. Dave was strongly of the view that there was a link between the two murders. And there are many similarities, many similarities. The West Midlands police were of a contrary view. They didn't want to link the investigations.
So two separate, almost parallel inquiries were set up, one run by West Midlands and one by Leicestershire. But the fears persisted that police in reality were chasing a serial killer. In 1994, two women had been killed. Same-O Paul and Tracy Turner were both found strangled in isolated country lanes in Leicestershire. The two murders weren't being formally linked, and there was no obvious motive for killing these two women, who had both been connected to sex work.
I know back at the time of the Yorkshire Ripper, a lot of people were convinced that the case wasn't treated as seriously because they were sex workers. I never felt that about the case of Same-O Paul and Tracy Turner. I always believed that the officers who investigated those cases always took it seriously and were always determined to try to get to the bottom of who'd killed them.
Against a background of fear that a Midlands Ripper might be killing prostitutes, the investigation into Same-O Paul was being run by West Midlands Police. There was very little forensic evidence to go on, but there had been a potential sighting by a woman near where Same-O's body was found.
She saw a brown Ford Sierra go down that lane, Swinford Lane, and she looked at the car and a couple of things stood out to her. One was that there was a guy driving it, a male driving it, and the female passenger wasn't in the passenger seat, it was in the back seat behind him. The second thing was, mid-December, a cold month, this lady was only wearing a top, a vest, a negligee, something very slight. And the third, as the car turned around the corner, the body slumped slightly and she was of the opinion that this lady was dead. On that day, she went home and told her family. And her family didn't dismiss it completely, but they certainly didn't treat it seriously. And so they watched the news that night, and there was nothing on the news of any relevance, so the whole thing was forgotten. Then, weeks later, when Same-O had been found, and there was big publicity with a picture of Same-O, she said to her family, "That's her. That's the lady I saw."
That woman contacted the police and gave a statement. And another potentially significant lead from a witness in Birmingham could have been connected.
The witness had seen a struggle taking place in the Borsal Heath area and a guy trying to drag a woman into a car. She called the police, and the vehicle she described as a brown vehicle and remembered at least 3 numbers and letters from the registration number.
But the hunt for the Sierra petered out without success.
The West Midlands case went cold very quickly. They carried out their investigation. It wasn't lengthy, and they concentrated particularly on Seamo's partner at the time who lived with her, and really looking at suspects in the Borsal Heath area, of which they identified no one as a main suspect.
So the killer remained at large, potentially free to strike again. With few leads from the investigation into Seamo's murder, could forensic evidence from Tracy provide clues to who killed the women?
Fragments of yellow paint were on the body, and there was some yellow paint when we went back to where the body was lying, and those were recovered. They were little flecks if they'd sort of broken off something. There were quite a number of them, so there were obviously quite a lot of chips lying around where she'd picked them up from as a passive sort of transference.
But it was consistent with a car being resprayed or some kind of car paint respray material. It's quite distinctive. It's a yellow colour.
We thought at the time it might have something to do with the construction of the A14, which was just to the south of there, and there was almost like a moving village of contractors moving along. We thought perhaps it was someone there, all these diggers, and they've all got yellow paint, perhaps. But again, that proved to be a sort of bit of a dead end.
So the yellow paint flecks were ultimately of no use. But there was evidence of what vehicle Tracy's killer may have been driving, and it wasn't a brown Sierra.
At the scene of Tracy Turner's murder, there was tyre marks on the verge. It's quite a wide verge.
Specialist officers investigated that. They could identify the type of tyre, the width of the tyre, the tread of the tyre, and then, astoundingly, they could even tell which car it would have been fitted to.
And experts believed that the tyres were fitted to a Citroën BX19.
And there seemed to be one potentially critical piece of forensic evidence. Swabs taken from the scene of Tracy's murder revealed the presence of semen. Could this have been left behind by the killer?
We knew we'd got a semen sample, which meant that we were able to get a DNA profile. Unfortunately, it didn't match anything on the DNA database.
There were no hits whatsoever, either on other crime scenes or on suspects. So then they started the challenge of, okay, where do we go and DNA people, and who are they? Which was really complicated. So if you have a murder take place in a village, for example, of 2,000 or 3,000 people, you might decide to look at men aged between age X and Y. But because of where Tracy was found, and because of the fact she'd been abducted from somewhere 60 miles away on a motorway service station, where do you start your trawl, and who do you go to? So Leicestershire Police and the investigating team had to work out who we start to take DNA samples from as potential suspects. DNA trawls were taken near to Tracy's place where she was left. At that time, the A14 was being built. There was a huge site with a lot of workers there, transient workers. A lot of DNA profiles were taken, and the case continued, as I say, for a long, long time. And sadly, in the end, when you can't do any more, you can't do any more, and it closed.
The killer of Tracy Turner had evaded one of the biggest manhunts in the history of Leicestershire Police. But although the case went onto the back burner, it was never completely shelved.
I remember talking to detectives in Leicestershire about this case as part of a larger investigation into unsolved crimes and potential serial killers. And so you're clearly aware that they've not forgotten about these two women.
Certainly, the forensic evidence was retained, and that was to prove crucial.
That DNA profile was put onto the National DNA Database. Every person that was charged with an offence had their DNA taken, and it was put on the database, and all crime scene DNA profiles were also put on the database. So we had a number of years where lots and lots of potential matches were getting put onto the database. But again, we heard nothing. It was just a matter of sitting and waiting.
But then, in March 1998, Orlando Elmhurst received the news he'd all but given up hope of ever receiving.
I was sitting in my office and I got a knock on the door, and it was one of my administrative officers, and they were holding a faxed report, which was a DNA hit. A DNA hit is effectively where a crime scene sample matches an individual. And in this case, the crime scene sample, there was a reference number, our reference number, but it had the offence type, and it was murder.
There had been a match to the DNA from the semen found in the Tracy Turner case. It was from a man accused of a rape in Weston-super-Mare. Orlando took the findings to Mick Creedon, who was now a detective superintendent for Leicestershire Police.
He came to see me excited, and he said, we've got a breakthrough on the Tracy Turner murder, and then told me about the fact there'd been a DNA hit from the DNA database, which was fantastic. And so immediately I started to think, okay, what does this mean? What's the implications? I was very clear to Orlando that no one needs to know about this, and we kept it very tight. The most important thing was that this didn't dribble out across the force, in the wider community, maybe with defence solicitors, because the obvious line of defence for a suspect would be, I use prostitutes, and that forensic intelligence is irrelevant because I didn't do the killing. It was clear to me that this was going to be a significant investigation, enormous investigation, because I knew the linkage between Samo and Tracy. I knew whoever done it was clearly a very evil individual with potential for more.
Forensic science had reopened the door to investigating the murders of Tracy Turner and Samo Paul. March 1998, and police had made a breakthrough in the Samo Paul Tracy Turner murder investigations. 4 years after the second murder, that of Tracy, a recent DNA sample on the national database had been matched to a sample found on her body.
There'd been a rape in Somerset in December '97. DNA had been taken from the suspect. The crime scene from Tracy Turner was on the database, and this DNA gave a match. So we suddenly, from nowhere, we had a name of a potential suspect for Tracy's murder.
That name was Alan Kite. He was 33 years old and lived in Staffordshire. At face value, Kite was immediately an obvious candidate. He was a part-time van driver who knew the motorway network that connected the victims to the crime scenes. And he was in custody charged with a serious sexual assault.
In December '97, he was living in a hostel in Weston-super-Mare. He befriended a lady. He took her out drinking. They went back to the hostel. He raped her at knife point. He fell asleep briefly, and she luckily managed to escape. She went to see the warden of the hostel, and the warden called the police. So they arrested Alan Kite. He denied the offence. He claimed consensual sex. But his DNA was taken, and that's what gave us the link to Tracy. We have now a strong suspect. The mistake would be to rush and go and interview the suspect. Pause. Everyone pause. First thing I do was get a team together. We set about essentially reading every single piece of paper, every action from the system, every statement, every exhibit we went through. And what we were looking for was lines of inquiry and anything that could potentially relate to Alan Kite, which of course we found in there because Alan Kite was in the first investigation.
On the original inquiry, the Tracy Turner inquiry, there was a lady who worked at a petrol station stroke service station, an area of Birmingham, and she was suspicious about a man who came into the garage and told this lady that he was a reporter, and she looked at him, he didn't look like a reporter, and was highly suspicious of him.
The apparently bogus journalist had asked questions about whether the murder victims had been seen in the service station.
The woman that was working there was really concerned about this. Took the vehicle number, that was passed to the incident room in Leicestershire, who then did some work on it, and they identified Alan Kite.
At the time, when they investigated it, Alan Kite was at Stafford HMP.
He was actually serving in prison for, I think, a petty theft offence.
They went to see him at the prison.
And he's arrogant, he's plausible, he's really quite convincing, and he said it wasn't him, it was a mistake. And they left him.
And a key piece of forensic evidence also linked Kite to the Tracy Turner murder inquiry. Specialist forensic motor teams had identified that tyre marks at the crime scene belonged to a Citroën BX19. Inquiries revealed Kite was using a vehicle of this type in March 1994. Links to Samo's killing were less obvious, but police were now formally linking the two murder cases, a view shared by the press.
Tracy Turner, like Samo Paul, was a sex worker. I just didn't feel it was a coincidence that the bodies were dumped so close together in a manner that was very similar, and both of them were strangled. I'm not an investigator, but it did feel like to me that they were connected.
And there was some evidence linking Kite to Samo's murder, especially the woman who'd witnessed what may have been her abduction by a man in a brown car in Birmingham's red light area.
When I spoke to her and took a statement again from her, even 4 years later, she remembered far more than was said in her initial statement. And the key things were the colour of the car, vague description of Kite, and the fact that she remembered certain parts of the registration number. And we could trace that vehicle to Kite.
Alan Kite was arrested in prison in connection with both murders, and detectives prepared to question him. There was a clear strategy planned for the interview.
It was really important in this case that we let Kite give his account and his explanation, and don't front load him with our evidence. Some officers are too keen to give all the evidence away at the start of an investigation.
When we looked at the interviews that were conducted over the rape in Weston-super-Mare, it was apparent that he was quite friendly with the interviewers and also quite pushy and quite confident and quite arrogant. We did what we call a phased disclosure interview. At that time, it was pretty unusual.
Number one, you prepare. Secondly, you engage with the individual. Thirdly, you get an account from the individual. Fourthly, you challenge the individual. Fifthly, you evaluate.
It was crucial that the revelation that police had Kite's DNA was kept from him as long as possible.
I was really concerned that he's just going to walk in and say, do you know what, guys, I've sex with prostitutes regularly, I have done for years, and if there's anything forensic, don't look at me because I didn't kill them. That would have been problematic.
Pete Priestley started his interviews with Kite on the 20th of May, 1998.
He answered lots and lots of questions, a lot of useful stuff about what vehicles he was driving around the time and his movements around the time. And he was almost indignant when we asked him whether he had sex with prostitutes. You know, me, I don't have sex with prostitutes. Almost, how dare you? That kind of attitude. And then we get to the point at the end of the interview where we reveal the evidence. But in this case, it was the one crucial one. And the crucial one was the DNA hit. He was visibly shocked. He was stunned, absolutely stunned. Didn't see it coming, never expected it.
Ultimately, Kite was charged with both murders. He was remanded in custody, where witnesses claim he made a shocking admission.
He was speaking to another prisoner there who had been convicted of murder, a guy from Birmingham. He told this guy that he had committed both those murders, Samo Paul and Tracy Turner, and other murders as well. Kai also told an old school friend of his that he'd killed 6 women, and that including in those 6 women was Samo Paul and Tracy Turner.
But when the court case started on the 28th of February 2000, Kite pleaded not guilty. He'd already been convicted of the rape in Weston-super-Mare the previous year, a fact that wasn't revealed to the jury.
He was very calm. He clearly was aware that his only way of getting off this case, this murder trial, was to convince a jury that he was a decent man and that the murders had nothing to do with him. He gave it a go. It didn't take a jury long to convict him. When his history was read out to the court, it was upsetting for one female member of the jury, particularly when they found that he was already serving a sentence for rape, a significant, horrific rape. The judge at the time said it was clear that Alan Kite despised the women. You could tell by the way he discarded their bodies like they were rubbish. But the judge told him that he was the one who should be despised. And he said he was clearly a very dangerous man.
Kite was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. Since then, he's been convicted of a further 11 offences, including the rape of a young boy in the 1980s. He was given an additional sentence of 10 years and 8 months. And police suspect he's committed many more crimes, including murder.
There's no question that had Kite not been caught, as a man in his mid to late 30s, as evil as he is, he'd have carried on. Lives have been saved by the fact that forensic science and the investigation and the jury managed to stop him.
But that's too late for Viella Paul, whose mother was taken away from her when she was just 8 months old.
No one can replace your mum. It's the person that brought you into this world, and they're not supposed to leave you. And she's left, and now there's no one. I would say to my mum that I love her, and no matter what mistakes she makes or if she ever needed help, I'd be there for her. Because I know that's what she did for me. We would have stuck it out for each other. And we never got a chance to have that conversation. And I think as well, maybe when she was in that position, the altercation, just leading up to the altercation with him, she's probably thinking, my child at home, she's going to need me, she wants me. And it's hard to think of someone that young having to struggle like that. Life was just taken from her. And now it's over. I have to move on. She'll always be remembered, even though don't know what she looks like or like anything she likes. I've built my own memory of her. And that helps me today. That keeps me standing.